They laughed at his medieval airfield trap until 6 fighters never made it off the runway. June 1944, Southern England. The airfield was already awake before sunrise, though very little moved. A low layer of cloud covered the sky, dull and uniform, reducing visibility and flattening sound. Moisture clung to the runway's surface, left behind by the night air. The concrete showed scars from repeated repairs. Patched sections where bomb craters had been filled quickly seemed still visible to anyone who knew where to look. This was a forward airfield, built for speed rather than comfort or longevity. It existed for one reason only: to keep Allied aircraft flying during the final push into occupied Europe. Since the Normandy landings, its importance had grown sharply. Fighters launched from here to escort bombers and strike targets across the Channel. Damaged aircraft returned here when they could not reach their original bases. Supplies moved through constantly, often under threat of attack. The field was also vulnerable. It sat in open countryside with minimal natural cover. Camouflage helped, but only from a distance. German air attacks had become increasingly frequent. Time to catch aircraft during takeoff or landing, when pilots had limited options and aircraft were fully exposed. Anti-aircraft guns were present, but not in sufficient numbers to guarantee protection. Fighter patrols could not be maintained continuously due to fuel constraints and operational demands elsewhere. Flight Sergeant Thomas Hale was part of the airfield's engineering detachment. He had arrived months earlier with the construction unit and remained after the initial build was completed. Hale was an experienced maintenance engineer trained before the war in mechanical systems and structural repair. He was not a pilot and had never been intended for combat duty. His responsibility was to keep the runway usable, repair damage quickly, and ensure that aircraft could operate safely under difficult conditions. Hale's daily routine was consistent. He inspected the runway surface at first light, reviewed damage reports from the previous night, and coordinated repair crews. He worked closely with ground staff responsible for fueling, rearming, and moving aircraft into position. His role placed him on the field during the most dangerous moments: takeoffs, landings, and post-attack assessments. In the days leading up to this morning, the situation had worsened. Enemy aircraft had struck the field repeatedly. In one attack, a fighter had been hit during its takeoff run and destroyed before leaving the ground. Another aircraft had been damaged beyond repair while parked near the runway edge. Hale had been present after both incidents, assisting with debris clearance and assessing whether the runway could be reopened quickly. He understood aircraft from a practical standpoint. He knew their weight when fully fueled, the stress placed on landing gear during acceleration, and how little margin existed during the first seconds of takeoff. From his perspective, aircraft were not symbols of air superiority. They were machines operating close to their limits. That morning, Hale walked along the center line of the runway with a clipboard, checking recent repairs. He stopped near a section where tire marks were deeply embedded into the concrete. This was where aircraft reached maximum acceleration before lifting off. He knelt briefly, examining the surface, noting how uneven repairs had altered the way wheels tracked along the ground. Nearby, ground crew prepared aircraft for the next sortie. Pilots waited for clearance. Everything appeared routine, but the tension was constant. Everyone on the field knew that another attack could come without warning. Hale remained focused on the same problem that had occupied his thoughts for days. Defensive measures were not improving. Additional guns had not arrived. Air cover was limited. The airfield would continue to be targeted. Standing on the runway, Hale considered the moment when an aircraft was most dependent on the ground. Not when it was parked, and not once it was airborne, but during the short window when speed increased rapidly and control options narrowed. Any failure at that point would be immediate and decisive. He made a note in his field book. It was not a formal proposal, only an observation recorded for later consideration. He wrote that stopping an aircraft during takeoff required no firepower if the ground itself could be made unreliable at the right moment. At the time, it was only a technical thought. Hale did not yet know how it would be received, or whether it would ever move beyond his notebook. But it marked the beginning of a shift. from repairing damage after attacks to considering how attacks might be stopped before they achieve their purpose. For the moment, his task remained the same: keep the runway operational, keep aircraft moving, and prepare for the next strike, which everyone on the field knew was only a matter of time. June 1944 continued, and with each passing day, the pressure on the airfield increased. The attacks did not stop. They became more deliberate. Enemy aircraft no longer came at random. They arrived at predictable hours, early morning or late evening, when light conditions worked against defenders and crews were exhausted. The pattern was clear to anyone watching closely. The Germans were not trying to dominate the sky above the airfield. They were trying to deny it. Flight Sergeant Thomas Hale began spending more time in the briefing tent, standing quietly at the back while officers discussed losses and defensive gaps. He was not there to speak. His rank did not invite attention, but he listened carefully to pilots describing how quickly enemy fighters appeared and disappeared, how little warning there was, how helpless they felt once committed to the takeoff run. One pilot, his voice flat and controlled, described watching tracer rounds pass across the runway as his engine reached full power. He said he knew he should abort, but by the time he made the decision, it was already too late. The aircraft had too much speed to stop safely and not enough to lift. Hale noticed how often the pilots spoke about that narrow window, those few seconds when everything depended on the ground beneath them. Hale's own work kept him near that same danger zone. Each time an aircraft was destroyed on the runway, he was among the first to arrive afterward. He inspected broken landing gear, shattered tires, twisted struts. He took notes, not out of curiosity, but habit. He recorded where failures occurred and how the damage propagated once control was lost. He knew these aircraft intimately. Many had been repaired repeatedly, patched, and returned to service under extreme time pressure. He understood how much punishment their landing gear could take, and how little disruption it took to cause total failure. Late one evening, after another minor attack had forced a temporary shutdown of operations, Hale remained on the runway longer than usual. Repair crews had cleared debris and filled shallow craters, working under floodlights that cast long shadows across the concrete. Once they finished, Hale walked the length of the strip alone, retracing the path aircraft followed as they accelerated. He stopped again at the same point he had noted days earlier. This was where pilots committed fully to takeoff. Abort procedures beyond this distance were rarely successful. Hale measured it again, confirming his earlier calculations. The margin was narrow, very narrow. That night, in the engineering hut, Hale began to sketch. The drawings were simple. No weapons, no explosives, just physical interference, something placed precisely where it would matter most. He considered materials already available on the field: steel cable, anchoring posts, scrap metal salvage from damaged aircraft, construction tools left behind from the airfield's original build. The concept was straightforward. If a wheel failed during the takeoff run, the aircraft would not recover. Control would be lost instantly. The speed alone would ensure destruction. The key was placement and concealment. Whatever was used had to be invisible from the cockpit and undetectable from the air. Hale knew how the idea would sound if spoken aloud. It lacked sophistication. It did not align with modern thinking about air defense. It resembled something older, something based on denying movement rather than overpowering force. The following day, Hale requested a brief meeting with the senior engineering officer assigned to the field. He presented his idea cautiously, using technical language rather than dramatic claims. He spoke about stress limits, wheel assemblies, and failure points. He avoided speculation and focused on mechanics. The reaction was immediate and dismissive. The officer listened, then shook his head. He said the proposal was impractical, dangerous, and outdated. Another engineer nearby laughed openly and commented that the war was not fought with obstacles buried in the ground. A pilot passing through the tent added that such ideas belonged in a different century. Hale did not argue. He expected the response. He gathered his notes and returned to his duties without protest. But the airfield situation continued to deteriorate. Losses mounted. Requests for additional defenses went unanswered. When the next attack damaged two aircraft before they could take off, the tone of the discussions changed. Options were limited. Resources were exhausted. Solutions no longer needed to be elegant. They only needed to work. Several days later, Hale was called back into the briefing tent. This time, the laughter was gone. The senior officer asked him to explain his idea again, slowly, in detail. Hale did so, outlining how the devices could be installed in a restricted section of the runway, tested away from normal operations, and removed quickly if necessary. The approval that followed was not enthusiastic. It was conditional and quiet. Hale was instructed to proceed without drawing attention and without disrupting scheduled flights. No written authorization was issued. As Hale left the tent, he understood the position he had been placed in. If the idea failed, responsibility would be his alone. If it succeeded, it would likely be dismantled without comment. That night, under strict blackout conditions, Hale selected a small group of trusted ground crew and began preparing the materials. The work would be done quietly, away from scrutiny, and completed before the enemy returned. The runway, for the first time since the field had been built, was about to be turned into a weapon. The work began after nightfall. Under blackout regulations, the airfield was reduced to faint shapes and controlled movements. No floodlights were used. Only shielded lamps and torches covered with cloth guided the men as they moved across the runway. Engines were shut down early that evening to create the appearance of routine inactivity. From the air, the field looked unchanged. Flight Sergeant Thomas Hale supervised every step. He selected a section of the runway that was rarely used for Allied takeoffs, a stretch long enough to allow acceleration but isolated enough to avoid accidental use. He chose it not for convenience, but for control. Nothing about the work could interfere with daily operations. Hale had chosen his team carefully. They were experienced ground crew and engineers, men accustomed to working under pressure and following instructions without discussion. None of them were told the full purpose of the project. Hale explained only what was necessary: measurements, placement, and timing. The first task was excavation. Shallow trenches were cut across the runway extension at specific intervals. They were narrow enough to be concealed easily, but deep enough to house steel anchors and cable housings. The concrete surface was removed in sections and set aside to be replaced later with careful precision. Hale measured each position personally. He referenced aircraft acceleration data and takeoff distances, confirming calculations he had already run repeatedly. The devices were not placed randomly. They were positioned exactly where aircraft would reach critical speed, where a pilot could no longer safely abort a takeoff. The materials were basic. Steel cables salvaged from damaged aircraft were inspected, cleaned, and cut to length. Anchor posts were fashioned from scrap steel and driven deep into the ground beneath the runway surface. Weak links were added deliberately, designed to fail upward under force rather than remain rigid. Hale explained the reasoning quietly to one of the crew leaders. If the cable remained fixed, it might shear or deflect harmlessly. If it snapped upward, it would strike the landing gear assembly or underside of the aircraft, guaranteeing structural failure. Once installed, the cables were tension low, resting just beneath the surface when covered. The trench was refilled carefully, compacted layer by layer. The removed concrete slabs were replaced and sealed. Finally, the surface was brushed and painted to match the surrounding runway markings exactly. The work was slow. Every step was checked twice. A single error could expose the installation or cause unintended damage. Hale remained on site until dawn, moving between stations, reviewing measurements, and making minor adjustments. By early morning, there was no visible sign of disturbance. The runway looked as it had the day before, scarred, patched, and ordinary. Aircraft resumed operations without incident. No one outside the small group noticed anything unusual. In the days that followed, Hale monitored the area constantly. He walked the runway during inspections, checking for signs of settling or exposure. He instructed the crew to report even minor surface changes. Nothing was left to chance. Privately, the weight of the decision began to settle on him. The installation was passive. It would not distinguish between friend and enemy. If an Allied aircraft attempted to use that section of runway, the result would be the same. To mitigate the risk, Hale ensured the area was marked on internal engineering maps and verbally briefed to select personnel without explanation. There were moments of doubt. Hale questioned his calculations, replayed scenarios, and reviewed failure modes late into the night. He understood the consequences if he was wrong. His idea was no longer theoretical. It existed beneath the concrete, waiting. The airfield remained under threat. Intelligence reports warned of continued enemy activity. Attacks were expected to resume within days. Hale stood alone at the edge of the runway one night, listening to distant engines over the channel. He knew the trap would never be tested deliberately. It would only be triggered by an enemy mistake or a calculated risk. Until then, it remained buried, silent, invisible, and dependent entirely on timing. The ground was ready. The attack came just before dawn. On the morning of June 18, 1944, visibility was poor. Low cloud covered the field, and a light ground fog reduced contrast along the runway. Conditions that might have delayed operations instead worked in the enemy's favor. Lookouts detected incoming aircraft only seconds before they appeared over the tree line. The first German fighters arrived at low altitude, engines at full power. They approached from the west, using the terrain to mask their movement. Tracer fire followed almost immediately as they strafed hangars, fuel points, and parked aircraft. Ground crew scattered for cover. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but the attackers were fast and already pulling away. The initial pass caused limited damage. No aircraft were destroyed, and fires were contained quickly. From the control area, it appeared that the raid might end as so many others had, with disruption but no decisive result. Then two enemy fighters broke formation. Instead of climbing away, they descended toward the runway. Observers on the ground hesitated, unsure of what they were seeing. The aircraft aligned themselves along the runway centerline, approaching from the same direction Allied aircraft normally used for takeoff. The possibility was immediately clear. Either the pilots believed the airfield was abandoned, or they intended to use it temporarily to extend their range. Captured airfields had been used this way before. The risk was high, but so was the potential reward. Flight Sergeant Thomas Hale was standing near the engineering hut when the aircraft began their approach. He recognized the alignment instantly. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The first fighter touched down roughly and began its takeoff run almost at once. The engine sound rose sharply as the aircraft accelerated. From the ground, everything appeared normal. The landing gear held. The aircraft tracked straight. At approximately 40 miles per hour, there was no visible change. At 60, the nose lifted slightly. Then the left landing gear struck the concealed obstruction. The failure was immediate. The wheel assembly collapsed inward. The aircraft veered violently, leaving the runway and tearing across the grass. The pilot attempted to correct, but control was already lost. The fighter struck the ground and disintegrated in a cloud of debris. Seconds later, the second aircraft attempted to abort its run. The pilot reduced power and tried to steer away. It was too late. Its right wheel hit the cable installation. The weak link failed as designed. The cable snapped upward under tension, striking the underside of the aircraft. Fuel lines ruptured. The aircraft skidded, rotated, and caught fire before coming to a stop near the runway edge. The entire sequence lasted less than 20 seconds. Confusion followed. Additional enemy aircraft circled briefly, unsure of what had happened. One attempted a shallow approach before pulling away. Another aligned for a landing, then aborted abruptly. Despite the warning signs, more fighters made separate attempts over the next several minutes. Some trying to land, others attempting immediate takeoff. Each met the same result. Landing gear collapsed. Tires shredded. Undercarriages torn open. None of the 6 aircraft became airborne. No explosives detonated. No guns fired in response to those attempts. The destruction was caused entirely by speed, weight, and mechanical failure. By the time the remaining enemy aircraft withdrew, The runway was littered with wreckage. Smoke rose in thin columns, but there was no sustained fire. The field was quiet again, broken only by the sound of crackling metal and cooling engines. Hale did not move from where he stood. He watched the wrecks in silence, his calculations now proven in the only way that mattered. The trap had worked, not because it was sophisticated, but because it exploited a moment no pilot could escape once committed. 6 aircraft had been destroyed or disabled without a single shot fired. And the airfield, for the first time in weeks, had survived an attack without losing a single Allied plane. When the noise faded, no one spoke at first. Ground crew emerged slowly from cover, unsure whether the attack was truly over. Anti-aircraft crews remained at their positions, weapons still trained skyward. Smoke drifted across the runway in thin, uneven lines. The wrecked aircraft lay where they had come apart, scattered along the strip, and just beyond it, their damage unlike anything the men on the field were used to seeing. There were no clean impact craters, no bomb scars. The destruction had been mechanical, abrupt, and precise. Officers moved cautiously onto the runway, stopping short of the wreckage. Pilots gathered in small groups, pointing at collapsed landing gear and twisted undercarriages. Several of them knelt beside the nearest aircraft, trying to understand what they were looking at. A tire had been torn clean from its mount. A strut had failed in a way that suggested sudden upward force rather than impact from above. Questions spread quickly, but answers did not. Flight Sergeant Thomas Hale was called forward shortly after. The senior engineering officer did not raise his voice. He did not express anger or praise. He simply asked Hale to explain, step by step, what had been installed and where. Hale walked the runway with them. He pointed out the concealed sections, now partially exposed by the crashes. Steel cable ends were visible, bent and scorched. The compacted surface had split open under stress, revealing the simple construction beneath. There was a long pause after the explanation ended. One of the pilots finally spoke. He said quietly that if the devices had been visible, he would never have believed they could stop a fighter at speed. Another added that the failures occurred exactly where pilots had no remaining options. The realization settled slowly. This had not been luck. It had been timing. Orders were issued immediately. The runway was closed. Wreckage was cleared under armed guard. Engineering crews worked through the day to dismantle the installations. Hale supervised the removal himself, ensuring nothing remained that could endanger Allied aircraft once operations resumed. By nightfall, the runway was usable again. No official report mentioned the method in detail. The incident was recorded as enemy aircraft losses during an attempted ground operation. The emphasis was placed on confusion and pilot error. The field command preferred it that way. Privately, discussions continued. Engineers from neighboring airfields visited under pretense of routine inspections. They asked careful questions. Hale answered just as carefully. He avoided claims and avoided credit. He spoke only about mechanics and limits. Within days, Hale was instructed to dismantle all remaining components and return the airfield to standard configuration. The reason was practical. The trap worked only under very specific conditions, and the risk to friendly aircraft was unacceptable once operations intensified. No commendation followed. No citation was issued. Hale returned to his previous duties, repairing damage, inspecting surfaces, and coordinating maintenance as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the attitude toward him had changed. Pilots who had once dismissed his ideas now nodded in recognition. Engineers consulted him more frequently. His notebook was no longer ignored. The laughter that had greeted his proposal never returned. The airfield resumed its routine rhythm. Aircraft launched and landed. Attacks continued, but the enemy no longer attempted to use the runway. Whether through observation or rumor, the message had spread. The ground itself had become unreliable, and in a war dominated by machines and firepower, that quiet lesson lingered longer than anyone expected. The airfield did not remain active for long. As the front moved east and Allied forces advanced deeper into Europe, operations shifted to newly captured territory. Within months, The runway that had once been attacked almost daily saw fewer aircraft. Eventually, it returned to the role it had always been meant for: temporary, forgotten, and replaced. Flight Sergeant Thomas Hale was reassigned before the year ended. His transfer orders contained no reference to what had happened in June. Officially, his record showed only routine engineering service at a forward airfield. He continued his work elsewhere, repairing runways, inspecting damage, and training younger technicians. He never spoke publicly about the trap, and no one asked him to. The incident survived only in fragments. A brief engineering note, a passing comment in a pilot's personal diary, a single line in an after-action summary noting that multiple enemy aircraft had been rendered inoperable during an attempted ground operation. No explanation followed. Years later, when the war was over and airfields like this one had returned to farmland, the episode remained largely unknown. There were no photographs taken of the installation, no diagrams preserved in official manuals. The idea did not become doctrine, and yet its significance endured. The success of the trap had not depended on advanced weapons or superior numbers. It relied on understanding limits, of machines, of pilots, of moments when commitment removed all alternatives. Once an aircraft began its takeoff run, the decision had already been made. The ground beneath it mattered more than anything in the air. Hale understood that war rewarded not only innovation, but restraint. He had not tried to outmatch the enemy. He had simply denied them a single opportunity at the exact point they needed it most. There was no celebration when the last wreckage was cleared, no ceremony when the runway reopened. The victory, if it could be called that, was silent and practical. It existed only in the absence of loss. In later years, as air warfare grew more complex and technology more dominant, stories like this became increasingly rare. Radar, missiles, and electronics took center stage. But beneath all of it, the same principles remained. Machines still relied on surfaces. Speed still carried risk. And the smallest interruption, applied at the right moment, could decide an outcome. The men who served at that airfield moved on with their lives. Some returned home. Some did not. The runway faded back into the landscape, its scars erased by time and weather. What remained was a reminder often overlooked in histories of the war. That courage was not always loud, that ingenuity did not always look modern, and that sometimes the most decisive act was not pulling a trigger, but knowing exactly where the ground could be made to fail. History remembered the battles in the air. It rarely remembered the man who turned a runway into a weapon and then quietly walked away.